My dad said, "This loser will never amount to anything." 10 years later, I knocked on his door. The sound of tearing canvas cut through the lecture hall like a whip crack. My father held the shredded remains of my painting above his head, his knuckles white against the wooden frame, while 32 students sat frozen in their seats. The afternoon light through the tall windows made the torn pieces flutter like wounded birds, and I watched my 6 months of work become confetti in his hands. Dr. Harold Vance didn't look at me when he spoke. He never did when the cruelty was this deliberate. His voice carried that professor's authority, the kind that made grown adults shrink in their chairs, and every word landed like a punch to the sternum. My name is Ethan, and this is my revenge story. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment with the city you're watching from. It really helps me bring you more stories. "Emotional garbage," he said, dropping the frame at my feet. "This is what happens when sentiment replaces discipline. When a student mistakes therapy for art." The class didn't laugh. They knew better. But I felt their eyes on me like heat lamps, watching, recording, filing this moment away as a cautionary tale. My father stepped closer, and I smelled the coffee on his breath, the same coffee he'd made in our kitchen that morning while telling me to be ready for critique. His hand moved before I could process it, an open palm across my face that echoed in the vaulted ceiling. The sting came second, after the shock, after the understanding that he'd just struck me in front of everyone who'd ever watched me try to become something. I bent down to gather the pieces, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the torn canvas. The floor was cold hardwood, polished and indifferent, and I saw my reflection in it. Distorted, small, pathetic. My backpack was already heavy with failed attempts from previous weeks, and I stuffed the new ruins inside, feeling the weight of all that wasted effort pressing against my spine. Nobody moved to help me. Nobody spoke. They all understood the unwritten rule. Harold Vance's son was not a student here. He was a lesson, a warning, a living example of what happens when you're not good enough. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes on the exit, counting the steps it would take to reach the door. "You'll never amount to anything," my father said as I walked past him. His voice was quieter now, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You lack the steel required for this world. You're soft, weak, a disappointment." I didn't answer. What could I say that wouldn't prove him right? My throat was tight, my vision blurred at the edges, but I kept moving, one foot in front of the other until I was in the hallway, then down the stairs, then outside where the autumn air felt like forgiveness. The university quad was empty except for a few students scattered on benches, and I walked without direction, just movement, just escape, until my legs gave out near the chapel at the edge of campus. I sat on the stone steps and let myself shake. The humiliation wasn't new. My father had been destroying my confidence since I was old enough to hold a brush, but this felt different, final, like a door closing that I'd never get to open again. I thought about quitting, about switching majors, about disappearing into some normal life where art was just a hobby and Harold Vance was just a man I saw at Christmas. But then I saw it. A flyer pinned to the chapel door, bright yellow paper fluttering in the breeze. Riverside Arts Collective, full scholarship available. Dedication required. Talent essential. Submit by Friday. I pulled it down with fingers that had stopped shaking, and for the first time that day, I felt something other than shame. The scholarship letter arrived in a plain white envelope 3 weeks later, and I read it standing in the rain outside our house because I couldn't wait until I got inside. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter. Your submission demonstrated raw potential and fearless vulnerability. Report to 847 Industrial Avenue on Monday." I didn't tell my father. I just packed my clothes into 2 duffel bags and left while he was teaching his morning class. The Riverside Arts Collective turned out to be a converted warehouse in the meat-packing district, where the smell of old blood still clung to the brick walls and the floors were stained concrete that never got warm. 7 other artists lived there, all of them older than me, all of them carrying stories I could see in their paintings. My space was a corner near the loading dock, 10 feet by 10 feet, separated from the others by hanging tarps that did nothing to block sound or cold. I bought a used mattress from a thrift store for $30 and slept in my coat for the first month because the heating didn't reach my corner. At night, I painted under a single bulb that swung from a chain, casting shadows that moved across my canvas like living things. The other artists were polite but distant. They'd heard about Harold Vance, about his famous lectures and his brutal standards, and they looked at me like I was damaged goods, a cautionary tale who'd wandered into their sanctuary. I heard the whispers when they thought I couldn't. That's Vance's kid, the failure. Wonder how long he'll last. Money disappeared faster than I'd imagined. The scholarship covered the space and basic supplies, but food, transportation, and anything beyond the bare minimum came out of my pocket. I ate instant noodles 3 times a day, the kind that cost 39 cents at the corner store, and I learned to make them last by drinking the broth slowly, like soup, like it mattered. My hands started to shake again, but this time from hunger instead of fear, and I painted through it, mixing colors until they matched the emptiness in my stomach. The other artists ate real meals, takeout from the Thai place across the street, groceries from the organic market downtown, and I watched them like I was studying a foreign language, trying to understand how they'd gotten to a place where food was just food and not a daily calculation of survival. 3 months in, I took a shift at a 24-hour diner 6 blocks away, washing dishes from midnight to 6 a.m., then coming back to paint until I passed out around noon. My hands were raw from the industrial soap they used, cracked and bleeding at the knuckles, and I wore gloves when I painted to keep from staining the canvas red. The cook, a Mexican man named Javier, would slide me free meals when the manager wasn't looking. Scrambled eggs, toast, sometimes a burger if it was a slow night, and those calories kept me standing when everything else wanted me to fall. I never told him why I needed them, but he knew, the way people who've been hungry always know. He'd nod when I thanked him, a brief acknowledgement that required no words, no explanations, no humiliation. My paintings from that period were dark, claustrophobic, full of corners and confined spaces. I was working on a series about confinement, about the way poverty crushes you slowly, and the other artists started to notice. One of them, a woman named Shanice, who painted huge abstract pieces full of color, stopped by my corner one evening and stood there for 10 minutes without speaking. Finally, she said, "Your brushwork is different. Tighter, like you're holding something back." I didn't answer because I didn't know how to explain that I was painting with my father's technique, the only thing he'd taught me that was actually useful, but turning it against itself, making it serve pain instead of perfection. She walked away, nodding, and 2 days later she brought me a set of her old brushes, professional-grade ones that cost more than I made in a week at the diner. The rejection came in small moments. Invitations to group shows that didn't include my name, conversations that stopped when I entered a room, opportunities that somehow always went to someone else. I understood the economics of it. I was the new guy, the young guy, the one with no reputation except as Harold Vance's failure, but understanding didn't make it easier. I kept my head down and painted obsessively, filling canvas after canvas with images that scared me, images I didn't fully understand but knew I needed to create. Behind the warehouse, there was a dumpster, where the local gallery threw out damaged supplies, and I'd dig through it after hours, finding half-empty tubes of paint, brushes with bent bristles, frames with cracked corners. One night, buried beneath broken pedestals and water-damaged prints, I found a wooden crate filled with rare pigments, cadmium red, genuine ultramarine, colors I couldn't afford in a lifetime. Taped to the lid was a small card that said simply, "Use them well." I never found out who left them, but I carried that crate back to my corner like it was treasure, like it was proof that somewhere in the city, someone believed I was worth the investment. Isabella Cruz found me through a photograph. I'd painted a mural on the side of the warehouse, a massive portrait of a man dissolving into geometric shapes, his face half human, half architecture, and someone had posted it online with the caption, new street art in the meat packing district. She showed up on a Tuesday morning while I was repainting a section that had gotten tagged overnight, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing a long black coat that looked expensive but worn. She stood 20 feet back, studying the wall with her arms crossed, and didn't introduce herself for a solid 5 minutes. When she finally spoke, her voice had an accent I couldn't place. Spanish, maybe, or Portuguese, and she asked me who taught me to layer depth like that. I told her nobody, which was a lie, but also the truth. Harold Vance had taught me technique, but I'd learned to paint by unlearning everything he'd drilled into me, by taking his rigid structures and letting them break into something human. Isabella nodded like she understood the contradiction, then asked if I'd be interested in showing at a small exhibition she was curating downtown. It wasn't a major gallery, just a converted loft space in Chinatown where experimental artists showed work that was too strange for the commercial scene. But it was a real show, with real viewers, and I said yes before she finished explaining the details. She handed me a card with an address and a date, told me to bring 3 pieces, and turned to leave. Before she made it to the corner, she stopped and looked back at me. "I read about Harold Vance," she said, "about his teaching methods, about his reputation for destroying confidence." My hands tightened on the spray paint can I was holding, and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, that reflex to defend or explain or make excuses. But Isabella wasn't accusing me of anything. She was stating a fact, the way you'd mention the weather or the time of day. "I've seen what men like that do to young artists," she continued. "They take everything soft and bright and crush it until only the hard parts remain. Then they call it discipline." She walked back toward me, close enough that I could see the lines around her eyes, the silver threading through her hair. "Your mural has softness in it still. That's rare. Don't lose it trying to prove you're hard enough." The exhibition was in 3 weeks, which meant I had to create 2 new pieces since most of my recent work was too rough, too unfinished to show publicly. I worked through my shifts at the diner, through the exhaustion that made my hands shake and my vision blur, through the doubt that whispered I wasn't ready, wasn't good enough, would embarrass myself in front of people who actually knew art. Isabella stopped by the warehouse twice to check my progress, and each time she'd spend an hour just looking, not commenting, not critiquing, just absorbing what I'd made. The other artists at the collective noticed her visits and started treating me differently. Not friendly exactly, but curious, like I'd suddenly become interesting instead of just pathetic. On her 3rd visit, Isabella brought coffee from a real cafe, the kind with actual cream instead of powder, and we sat on milk crates in my corner while she told me about her career. She'd been a curator at a major museum in Sao Paulo before moving to New York, had worked with artists whose names I recognized from textbooks, had built and destroyed reputations with a single review. "I stopped because I got tired of the game," she said, staring into her cup. "Tired of telling people what art should be. Now I just find things that move me and try to give them space." She looked at my paintings, the 3 I'd selected for the show, and nodded slowly. "These will make people uncomfortable." Good. Comfortable art is just decoration. Before she left that day, she made me an offer that changed everything. "I have a studio space in Brooklyn that's sitting empty," she said. 3 rooms, good light, actual heat. You can use it for 3 months, rent-free, while I'm visiting family in Brazil. Only condition is you paint something no one dares to paint." I asked her what she meant, and she smiled. A small, sad smile that suggested she already knew what I'd create. "Paint what scares you most," she said. "Paint the thing you've been avoiding because it hurts too much to look at directly. Do that, and when I come back, we'll talk about what comes next." She wrote down an address in Bushwick, handed me a set of keys, and walked out into the afternoon light. I stood there holding those keys like they were made of something precious, feeling the weight of possibility for the first time since I'd torn up that scholarship flyer and started this whole impossible journey. The studio in Bushwick was a converted factory floor with windows that ran 15 feet high and let in the kind of northern light that made colors look honest. I moved my mattress and supplies in on a Sunday, carrying everything across the city on 2 subway trains and a long walk, and spent the first night just sitting in the empty space, feeling the silence press against me like a physical thing. Isabella's offer had come with a challenge I couldn't ignore. Paint what scares you most. I knew exactly what that was. I'd been circling it for years, getting close and then backing away like it might burn me if I touched it directly. My father. Not as he appeared in family photos or university portraits, but as he existed in my memory. A man made of criticism and coldness, a shape that wore human features but felt like something else entirely. I started with sketches, dozens of them, trying to capture the way Harold Vance looked when he was destroying someone. His face had a particular expression during those moments. Not angry exactly, but focused, like he was performing surgery on your soul and needed to concentrate on getting the cuts just right. I drew his eyes first, then his mouth, then the set of his shoulders when he stood over a student's work. The sketches covered the studio walls, a gallery of cruelty in pencil and charcoal, and I lived inside them for 2 weeks before I touched a brush. When I finally started painting, I worked in a trance state, mixing colors without thinking, letting my hands move while my mind went somewhere else. The portraits emerged slowly, my father's face dissolving into architectural forms, his features becoming sharp angles and cold surfaces, his humanity bleeding away until only structure remained. The series grew darker as I went deeper. I painted him as a monument, as a machine, as a judge sitting in an empty courtroom. I painted his hands crushing flowers, his shadow falling across children's drawings, his reflection in broken mirrors. Each canvas was a variation on the same theme: intelligence without mercy, authority without compassion, a man who'd turned himself into an institution and forgotten there was supposed to be a person underneath. I worked 16-hour days, forgetting to eat, sleeping on the studio floor when exhaustion finally dropped me, waking up with paint in my hair and on my hands. The images scared me. They were too honest, too raw, too much like looking directly at a wound that had never properly healed. 6 weeks into the project, the harassment started. Someone created an anonymous account and began posting comments on every image I shared online, calling my work derivative trauma porn and fake suffering for attention. The comments were specific enough to hurt, detailed enough to suggest the person knew me, understood my techniques, had studied my influences. They said I was riding my father's reputation, using his name to generate sympathy, creating art that was nothing but revenge fantasy disguised as insight. The attacks came daily, sometimes hourly, and I watched my small following shrink as people started questioning whether my work was genuine or just calculated manipulation. I stopped posting for a week, then 2, focusing entirely on the paintings themselves rather than documenting the process. The series reached 12 canvases, each one a different iteration of Harold Vance as monster, and I arranged them in the studio like a chapel dedicated to pain. Shanice from the collective came by to see what I'd been working on, and she stood in the center of the room for 20 minutes without speaking. When she finally turned to me, her face was pale. "These are going to destroy you or save you," she said. "There's no middle ground with work like this." She left without saying anything else, and I stood alone among the portraits, wondering if she was right, wondering if I'd gone too far into territory I couldn't come back from. The private message arrived late on a Thursday night while I was cleaning brushes. The anonymous account that had been tormenting me sent a single line that made my hands stop moving. "You forgot who taught you to paint." Below, it was a signature, just 2 letters, simple and clear. HV. I read it 3 times, 4 times, trying to convince myself it was a coincidence, someone pretending to be my father for sick entertainment. But the timing was too perfect, the knowledge too specific, and deep in my gut, I knew it was real. Harold Vance had been watching me this whole time, tracking my progress, studying my work, and now he was letting me know he'd seen everything. I locked the studio door and sat in the dark among the paintings of his face, feeling something shift inside me. Not fear, exactly, but a cold clarity that made me understand this wasn't over, couldn't be over, until one of us finished what we'd started. Gavin Locke showed up to the Chinatown exhibition opening like he owned the place, wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than I'd made all year and carrying that casual arrogance that came from never having to struggle. I knew him from the Riverside Collective. He'd been there when I first arrived, painting huge abstract canvases that sold for impressive prices despite being technically mediocre. He'd left 6 months ago for a private studio in Soho, and the rumor was he had family money, connections, the kind of resources that turned average talent into commercial success. He walked past my paintings without looking at them, grabbed a glass of wine from the table, and spent the evening networking with collectors like this was his show instead of mine. 3 days after the exhibition, my laptop got stolen from the studio. I'd gone out for coffee, leaving the door unlocked like an idiot, and when I came back the computer was gone along with my external hard drive. The physical paintings were untouched, but 5 years of digital files had vanished. Sketches, photographs, process videos, everything I'd used to document my work. I filed a police report, but the cop who took my statement made it clear that stolen laptops in Brooklyn were basically unrecoverable, especially when there were no witnesses and no security cameras. I felt sick for 3 days, not because of the hardware but because of what was on it. My entire archive, my only proof of how I developed my techniques, my only evidence of the chronology of my work. 2 weeks later, Shanice sent me a link with no message attached. It was an Instagram post from Gavin Locke's account, showing a painting that made my blood stop moving. The composition was mine, exactly mine, taken from a sketch I'd uploaded 6 months ago. The color palette was mine. The brushwork was a decent imitation of my style, and the subject matter was pulled directly from my stolen files. He'd titled it Dissolution Series No. 3 and tagged it with major gallery handles, positioning it as his latest breakthrough. The comment section was full of praise, collectors asking about availability, critics calling it his strongest work to date. I scrolled through his recent posts and counted 9 more paintings, all of them variations on my techniques, all of them dated after my laptop disappeared. The accusation came fast and brutal. An anonymous account tagged me in the comments asking why I was copying Gavin Locke's signature style. Someone else chimed in with a side-by-side comparison, showing one of my paintings next to his, suggesting I was the plagiarist. The conversation spread across platforms, picking up momentum, and within 48 hours I was being called a thief, a fraud, someone who'd stolen another artist's work and tried to pass it off as original. Gallery owners who'd shown interest went silent. The Riverside Collective asked me to remove my pieces from their common area. Isabella called me from Brazil, her voice tight with confusion, asking if I'd really copied another artist's work. I sat in the studio surrounded by my paintings and considered burning them. Not in some dramatic gesture, but just to make them stop existing, to erase the evidence of my failure and start over as someone else. I had a lighter in my hand, standing in front of the first portrait of Harold Vance, when my phone buzzed with an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was, "You need to see this," and the body contained a single link to a video file. I almost deleted it, probably more harassment, more proof of how badly I'd failed, but something made me click it. The video loaded slowly, buffering in chunks, and when it finally played I saw my father standing at a podium in front of a lecture hall. The video was old, maybe 10 years, and the quality was grainy, but the audio was clear. Harold Vance was giving a lecture on brush techniques, demonstrating on a large canvas while students watched from tiered seats. He showed a specific method for layering depth, building up thin glazes in a pattern that created dimensional illusion, and my hands went numb because I recognized it immediately. It was my technique, the one he'd mocked me for using, the one he'd called amateurish and self-indulgent. "This approach," he said in the video, "is an experimental method I've been developing. Notice how the layers interact, creating depth without relying on traditional perspective." He continued demonstrating, using the exact sequence I'd developed through trial and error, the exact combination of movements I discovered when I was 16 and trying to paint fog. The timestamp on the video was 3 months before I'd first shown him the technique. The journalist who'd sent it included a note at the bottom. Found this in the university archives. Thought you should know your father's been stealing from you longer than you realized. Isabella came back from Brazil a week early, walking into the studio without knocking and finding me surrounded by printed documents, highlighted articles, and a timeline I'd been constructing on the wall. She looked at the evidence spread across the floor, decades of my father's publications, student testimonials I'd tracked down through university forums, financial records I'd obtained through Freedom of Information requests, and her face went rigid with understanding. "How long has this been going on?" she asked, and I told her what I'd discovered. Harold Vance had built his reputation on stolen work, systematically taking his students' innovations and publishing them as his own research, selling their paintings through anonymous channels and pocketing the profits while they struggled to survive. We spent 3 days going through everything, building a case that was methodical and irrefutable. Isabella had connections to university archives, access to databases I couldn't reach alone, and she knew how academic fraud worked, where the bodies were buried, how to trace money through the labyrinth of institutional funding. We found pattern after pattern. Students who'd developed unique techniques and then watched as Harold Vance published papers about those exact methods 6 months later. Artists who'd left the program broken and penniless while my father's bank accounts grew fatter. Gallery owners who'd sold academic studies that matched the style of former students too perfectly to be coincidence. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and I felt something cold settle in my chest as I realized the scale of what he'd done. The hardest discovery came in a box of letters Isabella found in a storage facility the university was clearing out. They were correspondence from my mother to the dean, written during the last year of her life, begging the administration to investigate my father's practices. She'd seen what he was doing, had documentation, had testimonies from students who'd trusted her with their stories. "Harold is destroying these young people," she wrote in one letter dated 3 months before she died. "He takes their best work and claims it as his development, his innovation. I can't stay silent anymore, not when I see what it's doing to them, what it's doing to our son." The dean's response was brief and cold. "Mrs. Vance, your husband is one of our most respected faculty members. These allegations are serious and would require substantial proof. Unless you can provide concrete evidence, I cannot pursue this matter further." I sat on the studio floor reading my mother's letters, feeling fury and grief merge into something I didn't have words for. She'd tried to stop him. She'd seen the truth and fought against it, and the institution had chosen Harold Vance's reputation over her testimony, over the truth, over the lives he was ruining. The final letter was dated 2 weeks before her heart attack, and her handwriting was shaky, rushed, desperate. "I've gathered everything I need. The evidence is clear. I'm meeting with a journalist next Tuesday." But she never made it to that meeting. She died in her sleep, and the evidence she'd gathered disappeared, probably destroyed by my father or lost in the chaos of her death. I held those letters and understood that I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was finishing what my mother started. Isabella found the smoking gun buried in metadata. One of the paintings Gavin Locke had posted, supposedly his original work, had a timestamp in the file properties that predated his post by 6 months. The date matched exactly with my stolen laptop, and when we traced the upload history, we found the file had been transferred from another device before being posted. That device belonged to Gavin, but the original creation date was impossible to fake, hard-coded into the file itself. We had proof that he'd stolen my work, but more importantly, we had a method. If Gavin's theft could be proven through metadata, maybe my father's could be too. We requested archived files from the university, claiming we were researching Harold Vance's pedagogical evolution for a documentary project. The administration, proud of their famous professor, handed over decades of digital records without questioning our motives. Isabella and I spent a week analyzing timestamps, comparing original student submissions with later publications, tracing the flow of intellectual property from unknown artists to my father's portfolio. The pattern was crystal clear. Students would submit work as part of their coursework, and 6 months later, my father would publish papers or show paintings that were variations on those exact themes, those exact techniques. One timestamp was missing, though, a critical file that would prove he'd accessed a student's work before publishing his own version. Without it, we had pattern and circumstance, but not absolute proof. Isabella leaned back in her chair and looked at the evidence wall. "We need to force his hand," she said. "Make him respond publicly. Make him defend himself in real time. That's when people make mistakes." I nodded, understanding what she meant, and started planning something that would either destroy him or destroy me. The university's annual gala was a black tie affair where wealthy donors paid $500 a plate to congratulate themselves on supporting the arts. This year, Harold Vance was receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award, recognition for his transformative contributions to contemporary American art and his dedication to nurturing young talent. The event was held in the main gallery, a glass-walled building on the edge of campus with floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the sculpture garden where students gathered to smoke and gossip. That's where I set up my projection equipment, hidden behind the maintenance shed, pointing 3 high-powered projectors at the gallery's exterior walls. Isabella had helped me compile the evidence into a presentation: student testimonials, financial records, side-by-side comparisons of stolen work, my mother's letters, all of it synchronized to run on a loop. The gala started at 7. I started the projection at 7:30, when the cocktail hour was in full swing and people were standing near the windows with their drinks and their small talk. The first slide appeared on the glass. My father's face, enlarged to 20 feet tall, with the words "academic fraud" printed beneath it. I heard the murmurs start immediately, watched as people turned to look, confusion spreading through the crowd like ripples in water. The next slide showed a painting Harold Vance had sold 5 years ago beside a student's original work, dated 6 months earlier, identical in composition and technique. The slide after that showed bank records, money flowing from anonymous gallery sales into my father's accounts while the original artists worked minimum-wage jobs. I stood in the shadows and watched my father's face through the windows, saw the exact moment he understood what was happening. He moved toward the glass, his expression shifting from confusion to rage, and I felt a cold satisfaction watching him scramble. The crowd was gathering now, phones out, recording the projection, sharing it in real time. Isabella had timed everything perfectly. The evidence was airtight, the presentation professional, and the location made it impossible to ignore. Security guards appeared, running toward the sculpture garden, but I'd positioned the equipment behind a locked fence that would take them at least 10 minutes to breach. 10 minutes of truth, projected onto glass for everyone to see. The police arrived at 8:15, along with campus security and the university's legal team. They shut down the projectors, confiscated my equipment, and arrested me for trespassing, vandalism, and disrupting a public event. I didn't resist, didn't argue, just let them put me in handcuffs and walk me to the patrol car while donors and faculty watched from the gallery steps. Someone threw a drink at me. I felt the cold splash against my back, and someone else shouted that I was a bitter dropout who couldn't accept his own failure. The internet response was swift and brutal. By the time they processed me at the station, I was trending on social media as a cautionary tale about entitlement and resentment. Art critics published think pieces about the dangers of cancel culture. Former students defended Harold Vance, calling him demanding but fair. The narrative was clear. I was the villain, the ungrateful son who'd attacked a respected educator out of spite. I sat in the holding cell and felt the weight of failure pressing down like water. Everything I'd worked for, all the evidence I'd gathered, all of my mother's fight, it was being dismissed as drama, as personal grievance, as the tantrum of someone who couldn't handle honest criticism. The other people in the cell gave me space, sensing something was wrong but not wanting to get involved. I closed my eyes and tried to figure out what came next, how I could possibly recover from this, whether there was any path forward that didn't end with me giving up entirely. My phone had been confiscated. But when they returned my belongings 6 hours later and released me with a court date for misdemeanor charges, I found 3 missed calls from an unknown number. I called back from a payphone outside the station, using quarters I'd borrowed from the desk sergeant. A woman answered, her voice professional but excited. "Mr. Carter, this is Miranda Wells from the New York Contemporary Arts Foundation. I've been trying to reach you for the past hour. Someone's been selling paintings under your father's name, but the style matches your work exactly. Anonymous dealer, high-end collectors, prices in the 6 figures. I think you need to see the catalog." She gave me an address in Midtown, an auction house I'd heard of but never entered, and told me to come immediately. I hung up the phone and stood on the sidewalk as dawn broke over the city, feeling something shift inside me one more time. Not hope exactly, but recognition. Harold Vance wasn't done stealing from me, and I wasn't done fighting back. The auction house occupied a limestone building on East 67th Street, the kind of place where doormen wore white gloves and the lobby smelled like old money and furniture polish. Miranda Wells met me in the reception area, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a tablet full of documentation. She led me to a private viewing room where paintings hung on temporary walls, each one spotlit and labeled with estimated values that made my vision blur. "These are from the Vance collection," she said, watching my face carefully. "Anonymous consignor. They surfaced 3 months ago through a private dealer. Very exclusive, very expensive. And they're yours, aren't they?" I walked along the row of paintings, recognizing each one like seeing old photographs of yourself. These were pieces I'd created years ago, early work from my time at the university, paintings I'd left in my father's garage because I didn't have space in my first apartment. I'd assumed he'd thrown them away or donated them to the university archive. Instead, he'd kept them, stored them, and now he was selling them as lost academic masterpieces from the private collection of Dr. Harold Vance, rediscovered studies demonstrating his revolutionary approach to contemporary portraiture. The price estimates ranged from $80,000 to $250,000 each. There were 12 paintings total, a $1 million collection built from my stolen work. Miranda showed me the catalog copy, and I read the descriptions with mounting fury. This piece exemplifies Vance's middle period, when he was experimenting with dimensional layering techniques that would later influence a generation of artists. I did note the sophisticated use of cold tones to create emotional distance, a hallmark of Vance's psychological portraiture. Every description attributed my techniques to my father, positioned him as the innovator, erased me completely from the narrative. The auction was scheduled for 3 days from now, with private preview appointments already booked by major collectors. Miranda explained that she'd recognized the style from my exhibition in Chinatown, had seen the online controversy about plagiarism, and suspected something was wrong. "I can't prove these aren't his," she said, "but if they are yours, you need to go public before the auction. Once these sell, they'll disappear into private collections and you'll never get them back." I stood in that viewing room surrounded by my own work, priced like it was valuable, displayed like it mattered, and felt the full weight of what my father had done. He hadn't just stolen my techniques or my ideas, he'd stolen my actual paintings, the physical objects I'd created with my own hands, and was selling them for prices that would have changed my life if I'd received them. While I'd been eating instant noodles and washing dishes at midnight, he'd been building a collection worth over $1 million using my labor, my vision, my pain. Miranda made calls while I documented everything with my phone, photographs of each painting, close-ups of my signature hidden in the compositions, video of the catalog descriptions. She contacted a lawyer who specialized in art fraud, a journalist from the Times who'd covered similar cases, and a curator from a major museum who'd worked with my father and might be willing to testify. The plan came together quickly. I would attend the auction preview the next day, request to examine the paintings closely, and then reveal my ownership during the live auction with evidence that couldn't be denied. It was risky. If my proof wasn't solid enough, I'd be escorted out and possibly arrested again for disruption. But if I could prove these paintings were mine, Harold Vance's entire narrative would collapse under its own weight. That night, I went back to the Bushwick studio and pulled out every piece of documentation I had. Progress photos from when I'd created the paintings, sketches that showed the development of each composition, receipts for the canvases and paints I'd purchased with dates that matched the work. I found an old journal where I'd written about the paintings as I made them, describing my process and intentions in detail that no one else could have known. Isabella came over at midnight with coffee and her own archive. She'd been documenting my work since we met, taking professional photographs of pieces at different stages, and those images proved the paintings in the auction house were mine. We built a presentation on my laptop, every page a nail in Harold Vance's coffin, every piece of evidence another layer of undeniable truth. The preview was invitation only, but Miranda got me in as her assistant, and I walked through those gilded rooms in a borrowed suit, watching wealthy collectors examine my paintings like they were inspecting horses before a race. An older man in a Rolex spent 20 minutes studying one of my portraits, discussing the brushwork with his advisor, praising the mature restraint of the composition. I wanted to tell him I'd painted it when I was 19, crying in my father's garage after another brutal critique session, that every brushstroke was an argument against the man who'd raised me. Instead, I stood quietly in the corner and memorized their faces. These people who were about to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on stolen art. The auction itself was scheduled for 7 p.m., broadcast live to remote bidders around the world. Miranda had arranged for me to be in the room, seated in the back where I could see everything but wouldn't be immediately visible to the cameras. The lawyer she'd contacted warned me that I'd have one chance to make my case. If I stood up and claimed ownership without ironclad proof, I'd be removed and probably sued for defamation. But if my evidence was strong enough, if I could make the claim publicly during the live broadcast, the pressure on Harold Vance would be immense. The auction house would have to investigate. The university would be forced to respond, and the truth would finally have a platform bigger than my father's reputation. I sat in that auction room watching paddles rise and fall as earlier lots closed to faceless bidders on phone lines, and I waited for the right moment as the Vance collection was about to begin. The auctioneer was good, building excitement with each lot, describing my father's genius and innovation, while I gripped the arms of my chair. Miranda had arranged for lot number 9, a painting I'd created of my mother shortly after she died, to be the moment. When that painting appeared on the screen, I would stand up and tell the truth. The room would erupt. The broadcast would capture everything, and there would be no going back. The auctioneer was about to open the first Vance lot. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. And then my phone buzzed with a message from Miranda. Change of plans. Major NYC curator wants to buy the collection. She's offering to let you reveal the truth live on stage. This is bigger than we thought. The curator's name was Dr. Amara Johnson, and she ran the Museum of Contemporary American Art in Chelsea, one of the most prestigious institutions in the city. She'd been watching the auction remotely, had recognized my style from the projection incident that had gone viral, and had contacted Miranda with an offer. She proposed purchasing the remaining Vance collection works as a single lot for $2.3 million, contingent on the auction house withdrawing those lots and initiating an immediate provenance review, and on my agreeing to tell the complete truth at the museum's next opening. It was scheduled for the following week, a major show about artistic legacy and influence, and my story would be the centerpiece. The auction house, smelling scandal and publicity, paused the sale and, after conferring with the consignor and legal, agreed to withdraw the remaining lots pending a provenance review. Harold Vance had no say in the matter. The paintings were being sold through an anonymous dealer, and the consignment contract gave the auction house authority to negotiate a withdrawal. The week before the opening was chaos. Journalists started digging into Harold Vance's history, contacting former students, reviewing his publications with fresh skepticism. The university launched an internal investigation, though their statement carefully avoided any admission of wrongdoing. Social media turned on a dime. Suddenly, I wasn't the bitter son anymore. I was the whistleblower, the victim, the artist reclaiming his stolen work. Dr. Johnson's team worked with me to prepare a presentation that was devastating in its simplicity. Side-by-side comparisons, process documentation, expert testimony about brushwork and technique. Isabella coordinated with my mother's old friends, people who remembered seeing me create these paintings, who could testify to the timeline and my father's behavior. The opening night was packed, standing room only with cameras from major networks and journalists from international publications. I stood backstage in the museum's lecture hall wearing the same suit I'd worn to the auction preview, feeling like I was about to step off a cliff with no idea if there was water or rocks at the bottom. Dr. Johnson gave me a brief pep talk about speaking truth to power, about the importance of artistic integrity, but her words bounced off me like rain off glass. This wasn't about principles or politics. This was personal, final, the ending of something that had been building since I was 18 years old and watching my father tear my painting apart. The lights went down. Dr. Johnson walked onto the stage and introduced the exhibition theme, Provenance and Truth, examining the stories we tell about art. She spoke for 10 minutes about authenticity, attribution, and the systems that allow fraud to flourish. Then she said my name, and I walked out into the spotlight with my laptop and a laser pointer and a heart that felt like it was trying to break through my ribs. The audience was silent, waiting, and I saw faces I recognized. Professors from the university, artists from the Riverside Collective, collectors from the auction preview, and in the back row, partially hidden by shadow, my father. I didn't start with emotion or explanation. I started with evidence. I showed the first painting on the screen, the portrait of my mother, and then I showed my progress photos from when I'd created it, the journal entry I'd written describing why I'd chosen that particular expression, the receipt for the canvas dated 3 months before my mother died. I moved through each painting methodically, building the case piece by piece, letting the facts speak louder than any accusation. The audience was absolutely silent, the kind of silence that has weight and presence, and I felt their attention like a physical force. When I reached the 6th painting, I showed the timeline. I'd created it in my father's garage, stored it there when I moved out, and watched as he'd later sold it as his own work without telling me it still existed. Then I stopped presenting evidence and started telling the truth. "These are my paintings," I said, my voice steady despite everything shaking inside me. And that man, my father, taught me cruelty, not art. He taught me that vulnerability was weakness, that emotion was indulgence, that caring about anything made you a target. He took every soft part of me and tried to turn it into armor, and when I refused, when I kept painting with feeling and honesty, he called me a failure. I looked directly at Harold Vance in the back row, saw his face rigid with fury and shame. But the truth is simpler than that. He stole from me. He stole from his students for decades. He built a reputation on other people's innovation and called it teaching. And my mother knew. She tried to stop him, and the system protected him instead. The audience erupted, not with applause but with sharp intakes of breath, with murmurs, with the sound of collective realization that they'd been watching a crime unfold for years and calling it education. The aftermath happened fast. Harold Vance was suspended from the university within 48 hours, pending a full investigation. Major galleries pulled his work from their collections. Publishers canceled his forthcoming books. The New York Times ran a front-page story about academic fraud in the arts, using my father as the central case study. Former students came forward with their own stories of theft and manipulation, dozens of them, creating a chorus of testimony that was impossible to ignore. Sponsors who'd funded his research demanded their money back. The museum, named after his early work, quietly changed its dedication. Within a month, Harold Vance's name had gone from respected to toxic, his legacy transformed from innovation to caution. I felt nothing. That was the strangest part. I'd imagined this moment for years, fantasized about my father's fall, but now that it was happening, I just felt hollow. After the Provenance Review transferred title to me, the museum completed Dr. Johnson's purchase, and after legal fees and taxes I cleared $1.8 million, more money than I'd ever imagined having. I bought a real studio in Brooklyn, paid off every debt, set up a fund for art students who couldn't afford supplies. The money was life-changing, but it didn't fill the emptiness where triumph was supposed to be. Isabella warned me this would happen. She'd seen other people win their fights and then discover that justice doesn't heal wounds. It just stops them from getting deeper. 3 months after the exhibition, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a small wooden box, the kind used for storing important documents, and a note in my father's handwriting. "Meet me at the house. Bring this. You think you know everything, son. You don't." I stared at that note for an hour, debating whether to throw it away, but curiosity won. I opened the box and found letters, dozens of them, written in my mother's handwriting, addressed to me but never sent. They were dated from the last year of her life, and they told a story I'd never known. She'd been documenting Harold Vance's fraud not to protect his students, but to protect me, to build a case that would free me from his influence forever. The final letter was instructions for what to do with the evidence after she was gone. She'd been planning to expose him herself. I drove to my childhood home on a Tuesday afternoon in October, exactly 10 years after the day he'd ripped my painting apart in front of the class. The neighborhood looked smaller than I remembered, the houses closer together, the trees taller. My father's car was in the driveway, an old sedan he'd had since I was a kid, now rusted at the wheel wells and covered in pollen. I parked on the street and sat there for 10 minutes, holding the box, trying to decide if I actually wanted to do this. Part of me wanted to drive away, to let the silence be my final statement. But I'd come this far. I needed to see how this ended. Harold Vance opened the door before I could knock, like he'd been watching from the window. He looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, older in a way that went beyond years. His house was a mess, books piled everywhere, papers stacked on chairs, the smell of stale coffee and unwashed dishes. He didn't greet me, just turned and walked deeper into the house, assuming I'd follow. I did, stepping over debris, following him to his study where paintings I'd created as a teenager hung on the walls like trophies. He sat in his chair, the same chair he'd sat in when he used to critique my work, and gestured for me to sit across from him. I stayed standing. "You wanted to talk," I said, holding up the box. "Here I am." He looked at the box and something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe fear. "Your mother was wrong," he said finally, "about everything. She saw weakness and called it strength. She saw discipline and called it cruelty. She never understood what it takes to survive in this field." He felt anger rise in my throat, hot and familiar, but I kept my voice level. "She understood you were stealing from people who trusted you. She understood you'd built your entire career on lies. And she died trying to stop you." Harold Vance laughed, a bitter sound without humor. "Is that what you think? That I'm the villain in this story? I made you, Ethan. Every technique you use, every instinct you have, I taught you that. Without me, you'd be painting landscapes for tourists." I set the box on his desk, opened it slowly, and pulled out my mother's letters one by one. "She knew about all of it," I said, spreading them across the surface between us. "The students you stole from, the money you made selling their work, the way you destroyed anyone who threatened to expose you." Harold Vance didn't look at the letters. He looked at me, his expression shifting from defiance to something harder to read. "And what did that knowledge get her?" he asked quietly. "She died stressed and paranoid, seeing conspiracies everywhere turning against the man who built a life for her." His words were meant to cut, but they fell flat because I'd already heard worse from him, already survived worse. I picked up one specific letter, dated 2 weeks before my mother's death, and read aloud. "Harold has started threatening students who ask questions. Yesterday, a young woman came to the house crying, saying he'd failed her thesis because she refused to let him use her research. I'm scared of what he's become." My father's face hardened, but he didn't interrupt. I continued reading, letting my mother's words fill the room. Ethan is next. I see the way Harold looks at his paintings, the way he makes notes when Ethan isn't watching. He's planning something. I know he is. I have to protect my son. I set the letter down and looked at the man who'd raised me, seeing him clearly for maybe the first time. She died trying to gather enough evidence to stop you, I said, and you buried it all. Destroyed her documentation, dismissed her concerns, made everyone think she was unstable. Then you kept doing exactly what she'd accused you of, for another decade. Harold Vance stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. You self-righteous child, he spat. You think destroying my reputation makes you an artist? You think exposing me to the world proves you have talent? All you've done is confirm what I always knew. You're weak, vindictive, and you'll never create anything that matters without tearing down someone else first. He was trying to make me react, trying to push me into anger, or tears, or some response he could use against me. But I'd learned something in the past 10 years, something he'd never understand. His opinion didn't matter anymore. His approval or disapproval, his praise or criticism, his entire framework for judging value, it was all irrelevant because I'd built a life and a career outside his shadow. I didn't come here for a fight, I said, my voice calm. I came to give you something. I reached into my jacket and pulled out 2 photographs, prints of paintings I'd created specifically for this moment. The first showed my father as I remembered him from childhood. Strong, intelligent, commanding, the kind of man who made rooms fall silent when he entered. It was painted with skill and honesty, acknowledging what he'd been before he turned into something else. The second painting showed the same man dissolving, his features fragmenting into broken glass, his authority crumbling into dust. It was the truth rendered in oil and canvas. Not revenge, not anger, just documentation of what had actually happened. Harold Vance took the photographs with shaking hands, studying each one for a long time. His breathing was shallow, his face pale, and I watched as he processed what he was seeing. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why show me this?" I considered lying, giving him some poetic answer about forgiveness or closure, but we were past the point where lies served any purpose. "Because I wanted you to see what you look like from the outside," I said. "I wanted you to understand that the man you were and the man you became aren't the same person, and somewhere along the way, you chose to destroy the first one to protect the second." I turned toward the door, done with this conversation, done with this house, done with letting him occupy space in my head. "Ethan," he called out, and I stopped but didn't turn around. "I was trying to make you strong. Everything I did, the criticism, the discipline, the distance, I was trying to save you from being soft in a world that destroys soft people." I looked back at him then, at this old man surrounded by the ruins of his reputation, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. "You didn't make me strong," I said. "You made me careful. There's a difference." I left him standing there with those photographs, walked out of the house where I'd grown up, and drove away without looking back. The door closed behind me with a sound like punctuation. Final, clean, resolved. 6 months passed before I painted again. The money from the auction sat in my account like a weight, the security I'd never had before, and I didn't know what to do with it. I bought supplies, set up the new studio with professional equipment, created the kind of workspace I'd always dreamed of having. But when I stood in front of a blank canvas, nothing came. My hands would hover over the palette, mixing colors mechanically, and then I'd step back and stare at the white surface until my eyes hurt. The anger that had fueled my work for years was gone, burned away in the confrontation with Harold Vance, and I hadn't figured out what to create in its absence. Isabella noticed first, the way she noticed everything. She came by the studio one afternoon and found me sitting on the floor surrounded by empty canvases, all of them pristine and untouched. "You're waiting for permission," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. I asked her what she meant, and she sat down beside me, her back against the wall. You spent 10 years proving you were a real artist despite what your father said. Now you've proven it, won the fight, got recognition. But you still haven't given yourself permission to just create without it being a statement or rebellion or response to someone else's judgment. She was right, and I hated how right she was. Every painting I'd ever made had been an argument against Harold Vance, a proof of concept, a demonstration of worth. I didn't know how to paint just to paint. I started with sketches, nothing serious, just drawings of people I saw on the subway or sitting in coffee shops. No agenda, no deeper meaning, just observation and documentation. Then I moved to small canvases, studies of light through windows, the way morning looked on Brooklyn streets, the shapes shadows made on concrete walls. The work was quiet, simple, completely devoid of the intensity that had defined my previous paintings. At first, it felt like failure, like I'd lost whatever edge made my art matter. But slowly, over weeks and then months, I started to understand that this was what creating without trauma looked like. This was what art could be when it wasn't a weapon or a shield or a cry for validation. The other artists from Riverside Collective reached out, slowly at first and then more frequently. Shanice invited me to a group show. Nothing fancy, just a warehouse space in Queens where local artists displayed new work. I almost said no. The idea of showing paintings that weren't about my father felt vulnerable in a different way, exposing without armor. But I went, hung 3 small pieces, and watched people look at them without knowing my story or my history. A woman stood in front of one for 15 minutes, just looking, and when she finally walked away, she had tears on her face. She didn't know about Harold Vance or the stolen paintings or any of it. She just saw something in the work that moved her, and that was enough. Money changed things in ways I hadn't anticipated. I could afford health insurance, real food, the ability to say no to work that drained me. I set up a scholarship fund through the collective, full-ride support for 3 artists a year who were struggling the way I'd struggled. I bought Javier, the cook from the diner, a food truck he'd been dreaming about for years, showed up at the restaurant with the paperwork and the keys, and told him it was payment for all those free meals that kept me alive. He cried, which made me cry, and we stood in the parking lot like idiots. 2 men who understood hunger and what it meant to survive it. These weren't grand gestures. They were just ways of redistributing the resources I'd won from my father's fraud, turning stolen money into something useful. Dr. Johnson offered me a solo exhibition at her museum, a full retrospective with space for new work and complete creative control. It was the kind of opportunity artists spent careers building toward, and she was offering it to me at 28 years old because of the publicity, the story, the scandal. I told her I needed time to think about it, which was code for, I don't know if I'm ready. That night, I walked through the city for hours, from Brooklyn to Manhattan and back, processing what acceptance would mean. If I said yes, I'd be cementing myself as that artist who exposed his father. The story would follow me forever, define how people understood my work. If I said no, I might be throwing away the chance to actually build a sustainable career. I called Isabella from a bench in Prospect Park at 2 a.m, and she answered like she'd been awake anyway. "What do you want to create?" she asked, and I realized I didn't have an answer yet, but I needed to find one before I said yes to anything. The letter came to my studio on a Wednesday morning, forwarded from the university through several administrative channels before finding me. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky, barely legible, but I recognized it immediately. Harold Vance's. I held it for an hour before opening it, debating whether reading it would undo the peace I'd been building, whether his words could still hurt me the way they used to. Finally, I opened it standing by the window, sunlight streaming in, ready to throw it away if necessary. The letter was 3 pages long, written on legal paper with crossed-out words and revised sentences, the work of someone who'd tried multiple times to say something difficult. He didn't apologize. That was the first thing I noticed. No opening admission of guilt, no acknowledgement of harm, no request for forgiveness. Instead, he wrote about his own father, a man I'd never met, who'd been a factory worker in Detroit and who'd beaten Harold for drawing pictures when he should have been studying practical skills. He wrote about art school, about being the only black student in his program, about professors who'd called his work urban and raw, like those were criticisms instead of descriptions. He wrote about building a career through sheer force of will, about learning to be harder than anyone else because hardness was the only currency that bought respect. I became the thing I needed to survive, he wrote, and then I couldn't figure out how to be anything else. The letter continued with observations about my work, technical analysis of my paintings that showed he'd been paying attention even when I thought he wasn't looking. He described brushstrokes I'd used in specific pieces, compositional choices I'd made, the evolution of my color palette over years. "You paint with the vulnerability I had to destroy in myself," he wrote. "You kept the softness that the world beat out of me. I hated you for that, Ethan. I hated that you could be gentle and still create something powerful, that you didn't have to become a monster to survive." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to self-awareness I'd ever seen from him. This acknowledgement that he'd poisoned himself trying to meet impossible standards. The final page was different, more scattered, like he'd written it in fragments over several days. "The investigation destroyed everything. Lost my position, my reputation, my friends. People I've known for 30 years won't return my calls. Your mother would say this is justice, that I'm finally experiencing consequences I should have faced decades ago. Maybe she's right. Probably she's right." He wrote about finding old photographs of us from when I was young, before everything went wrong, images of him teaching me to mix colors and hold a brush correctly. "I remember thinking you had real talent. I remember being proud. And then, somewhere along the way, your talent became threatening instead of promising, and I couldn't separate teaching you from controlling you." The letter ended abruptly. No signature, just a final line. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know I see what I did, even if seeing it doesn't change anything." I sat with that letter for days, reading it repeatedly, trying to decide if it changed how I felt about everything that had happened. It didn't, not really. Understanding why someone hurt you doesn't make the pain less real or the scars less permanent. Harold Vance's trauma explained his behavior but didn't excuse it, and knowing he'd been damaged by his own father just meant the cycle of harm went back further than I'd realized. I thought about responding, writing my own letter explaining what his actions had cost me, how many years I'd spent trying to recover from his teaching. But every draft I started felt either too angry or too generous, too focused on blame or too willing to absolve. In the end, I didn't send anything. The silence felt more honest than anything I could have written. Instead, I painted. I created a new series called Inherited Wounds, exploring the ways trauma passes from generation to generation, the patterns that repeat until someone has the courage or luck to break them. The paintings were different from my earlier work, less about revenge and more about understanding, less about anger and more about grief for what could have been. I painted Harold Vance as a young man, full of hope and talent, before the world convinced him that softness was weakness. I painted his father, a figure I'd never met but could imagine from his letter, a man carrying his own damage forward. And I painted myself, breaking the chain, choosing to be vulnerable even when vulnerability felt dangerous. The series took 4 months to complete, and when I was done I felt something shift. Not forgiveness exactly, but release, like I'd been carrying weight I could finally put down. Isabella saw the new work and cried, which surprised me because she wasn't prone to emotional displays. "You've forgiven him," she said, and I corrected her immediately. I hadn't forgiven anything. "No," she insisted. "You've forgiven yourself for being his son, for carrying his DNA and his training. That's different from forgiving what he did." She was right again, frustratingly right, and I understood that this was what the past year had been about. Separating myself from Harold Vance's legacy without pretending it didn't exist. I was his son, trained in his techniques, shaped by his cruelty. But I was also something else, something he'd never managed to destroy no matter how hard he tried. I was an artist who chose gentleness, who valued emotion, who believed vulnerability made work stronger rather than weaker. And that choice, repeated daily despite everything I'd experienced, was its own kind of victory. The exhibition opened on a Thursday in November, exactly 1 year after I'd confronted Harold Vance in his study. Dr. Johnson had given me the museum's main gallery, 3,000 square feet of white walls and perfect lighting, space to display both the early work that had been stolen and the new series I'd created. The show was called Before and After, Ethan Carter's Journey from Theft to Truth, which felt reductive but accurate, and the opening night drew a crowd that spilled out into the street. Journalists came, collectors came, former students of Harold Vance came looking for validation or closure or both. I stood in the center of the gallery wearing a suit Isabella had helped me pick out, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, feeling simultaneously present and disconnected. Harold Vance didn't come. I hadn't expected him to, but his absence was its own kind of presence, a ghost haunting the margins of conversations. People would lower their voices when they talked about him. Glancing around like saying his name too loudly might summon something dangerous. A few former students approached me throughout the evening, thanking me for speaking up, sharing their own stories of theft and manipulation. One woman, probably in her 50s, told me she'd quit painting entirely after my father destroyed her confidence, and seeing my work displayed so prominently made her think about picking up a brush again. "You gave us permission to acknowledge what happened," she said, gripping my hand. "For years, I thought maybe I was just too sensitive, too weak to handle criticism. But you proved it wasn't just me." The money from the exhibition sales, Dr. Johnson had priced my new work aggressively, banking on the publicity, went toward expanding the scholarship fund. I created a full program, studio space, supplies, living stipends for artists who were struggling the way I'd struggled. The Riverside Collective partnered with me to administer it, and we named it after my mother, the Eleanor Carter Foundation for Emerging Artists. Isabella helped design the selection process, focusing on talent but also on need, prioritizing people who'd been told they weren't good enough, who'd been dismissed or stolen from, or systematically discouraged. We funded 12 artists the first year, full support for 24 months, no strings attached except a requirement to mentor the next group. It wasn't redemption. Nothing could redeem what Harold Vance had stolen from his students over decades. But it was something, a way of redirecting harm toward help. 6 months after the exhibition, I received notice that Harold Vance had died. Heart attack, sudden, alone in the house where I'd confronted him. The university sent a brief announcement, no memorial service, no celebration of his contributions. His obituary in the Times was short and clinical, mentioning his early innovations and his later disgrace without attempting to reconcile the two. I felt nothing when I read it. No relief, no sadness, no sense of closure. He was just gone, erased from the present tense into past history, and the world continued without him like water flowing around a stone. Isabella asked if I wanted to attend the burial, and I told her no. There was nothing left to say or witness, no final confrontation that would make anything clearer. The man had died the same way he'd lived the past year, alone, diminished, stripped of the power he'd once wielded so carelessly. I painted his portrait one last time, working from memory and photographs, trying to capture not the monster or the victim, but the complete person, contradictory, damaged, brilliant in some ways and catastrophically broken in others. It was the hardest painting I'd ever created because it required holding multiple truths simultaneously, that he'd hurt me deeply and that he'd also taught me skills I still used, that he'd stolen from me and that I'd learned resilience because of him, that he'd been cruel and that his cruelty had roots in trauma he'd never processed. The painting showed all of it, his intelligence and his viciousness, his talent and his corruption, his humanity and his monstrosity. When it was finished, I hung it in my studio where I could see it while I worked, a reminder of where I'd come from and what I'd survived. The final piece of the story came in the form of a package from Harold Vance's estate attorney. Inside was a single key with a tag reading Storage Unit 447, Brooklyn, Self-Storage, and a note explaining that my father had left specific instructions for this unit to be transferred to me upon his death. I almost threw it away. I didn't want anything else from him, didn't want to dig through more evidence of theft or lies, but curiosity won again, the same curiosity that had made me open his letter, and I drove to the storage facility on a cold January morning. Unit 447 was climate-controlled and enormous, filled floor-to-ceiling with paintings. My paintings. Every piece I'd ever created and left behind, stored carefully, cataloged meticulously, preserved like they mattered. There were hundreds of them, a complete archive of my artistic development from childhood through my early 20s. He'd kept everything. I sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit surrounded by my own history, understanding finally what Harold Vance had been unable to say in his letter. He'd stolen from me, yes, but he'd also saved everything I'd created, protected it, maintained it like it was precious. He'd sold some pieces for profit, but he'd kept most of them, building this secret museum of my work that nobody else knew existed. It was the most complicated gift I'd ever received. Proof of theft and proof of care existing in the same space, evidence that even his cruelty contained some distorted form of preservation. I spent the day photographing every painting, documenting what I'd created before memory and trauma had reshaped those early years into something simpler than the truth. The paintings showed a progression I'd forgotten, a young artist learning technique, making mistakes, finding his voice slowly through experimentation and failure. Some of the early work was terrible, honestly, the kind of amateur mistakes that make you cringe, but buried among them were moments of genuine insight, flashes of the artist I'd eventually become. Harold Vance had kept it all, the failures and the successes, like he'd been building evidence of my potential even while actively trying to destroy it. I donated most of the paintings to art schools and community centers, places where students could study them, learn from them, see the messy reality of artistic development instead of just the polished final products. Some pieces I kept for myself, hung them in my studio as reminders of where I'd started and how far I'd traveled. The best paintings, the ones that showed real growth, real courage, I included in a traveling exhibition about artistic evolution, showing how creativity develops through struggle rather than despite it. Critics called it brave, showing work that wasn't perfect alongside finished pieces, but it wasn't about bravery. It was about honesty, about refusing to pretend that art emerges fully formed without effort or doubt or countless failed attempts. Harold Vance had taught me perfection was the only acceptable standard, and I was teaching something different. That growth matters more than flawlessness. That vulnerability creates better work than control. The foundation grew larger than I'd anticipated. Within 2 years, we were supporting 40 artists annually, providing not just money but mentorship, community, practical business training. I hired people who understood struggle, former students who'd been exploited, artists who'd survived poverty, administrators who believed in equity rather than prestige. We partnered with galleries to create exhibition opportunities, with museums to offer residencies, with collectors to build ethical purchasing relationships that valued artists as people rather than commodities. The work was exhausting and rewarding in equal measure, and some mornings I woke up wondering if I was actually making a difference or just creating a more comfortable version of the same broken system. But then I'd receive letters from artists who'd been able to quit their third job, who'd created their best work because they finally had time and resources, who'd found their voice because someone believed in them. Those letters kept me going when doubt crept in. Isabella retired from curating to focus on teaching, and she asked me to co-teach a class on artistic integrity and professional practice. I said yes despite never imagining myself as an educator, and discovered that teaching felt different when you weren't trying to control or diminish your students. We created a curriculum about practical skills, contracts, copyright law, pricing work, negotiating with galleries, but also about psychological survival, managing rejection, protecting your creative spirit in an industry designed to exploit it. The students were hungry for this information, grateful that someone was finally admitting that talent alone wasn't enough, that you needed strategy and boundaries and self-preservation. Some of them had stories similar to mine, teachers who'd undermined them, mentors who'd stolen from them. I shared my experience not as inspiration but as navigation, showing them the rocks I'd hit so they could chart different courses. 10 years after I'd knocked on Harold Vance's door for that final confrontation, I painted a self-portrait. Not the version of me that existed in trauma or anger, but the person I'd become through surviving both and choosing something different. I painted myself in my studio, surrounded by works in progress, holding a brush with hands that were steady and sure. The background showed glimpses of my history, my mother's face, the warehouse where I'd nearly starved, the gallery where I'd reclaimed my stolen work. But they were shadows now, context rather than definition. The foreground was light, color, possibility. I hung that painting in my apartment where I'd see it every morning, a reminder that identity isn't fixed by what's been done to you, but shaped by what you choose to do next. Harold Vance had tried to make me in his image, hard and closed and cruel. Instead, I'd become something he never understood, strong enough to stay soft, successful enough to stay generous, confident enough to admit vulnerability. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Ethan's place? Leave your comment, like this video, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you want another powerful story, click on the video appearing to your left.